state school files on his kids, $10,000. And then this one, it's a legal case Nevada has against it, but it's just got what applies to the federal and the laws that they're in violation of. And there's some half sheets on the table where if you have a question after Mr. Izumi's through, you can write that down and we'll get the questions. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Lance Izumi.
Well, thank you very much, Carol. I really appreciate that. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming out in this deluge. You know, I thought I was at the opening of Noah, something like that. So thank you. I met Carol and several other folks over here down at the Nevada Governor's Mansion in Carson City. And she enjoyed what I have to say about Common Core and was so gracious to invite me up here to Susanville, which is a lovely place, especially in this rain. Being from Sacramento, where it's about 2 days ago it was 107, so I'll welcome this any day. So, again, it's great to be here with the Lassen Tea Party patriots, and all of you here are doing so much to fight for the principles of freedom and liberty, which we all share. And I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I mean, some of you may have read in the newsletter, I suppose, some of my biographical facts, but in case you didn't, I'm with the Pacific Research Institute, which is a conservative think tank based in Sacramento and in San Francisco. And I've been with them for the past 20 or so years. And I'm their Director of Education Studies. And I do a lot of different education work on things like Common Core, but also on issues involving school funding, school choice, testing, accountability, all that sort of thing. So I've been doing that for, gosh, a couple of decades, which is amazing, time flies, having fun, And before that I was actually a political speechwriter. So some of you may remember old Governor George Nation, and I was his chief speechwriter. And for those of you who do remember him, I was the one who gave the Duke all that charisma. So you still laugh. I'm really careful about how I use that joke, because who remembers George Nation anymore? So right, great state, great government. So anyway, and before that, I was actually a speechwriter, the personal speechwriter for U.S. Attorney General Ed Meese in President Reagan's administration. So I made a shift from writing for other people to writing for myself and writing about public policy. I was originally from the Los Angeles area. In fact, Tom Brown back there and I were talking, and we were sharing stories about the fact that he actually grew up in the town right next to me. I grew up in a place called Gardena, which is about 5 or 10 minutes south of LA Airport. And about the only thing it's known for is the fact that it had legalized poker. And so now every little city in Southern California has legalized poker. And so our city went broke. We're also trading stories about the fact that Tom was sharing how he had an injury last year. He broke a hip. And I, on the other hand, had my own little health issue. I actually, and this is not to get any sympathy, but I don't know whether you sent out in the newsletter a picture of my publicity photo, but before I used to have a full head of hair. And but the reason why I don't is actually, I actually had prostate cancer last year, and but I beat it. The doctors say I'm cancer-free right now, and. But the reason why I had chemo last year, but my wife wanted me to stay like this even when I got better, because I had this real obsessive compulsive thing about my hair. And I used to take forever to comb my hair, every hair in its place, and then hairspray it, right? And even when I would come home from work, I would tell my wife, "Don't touch my hair," And so once all my hair came off, she was able to rub my head like this, and she said she loved it. So, I've stayed like this ever since when the hair came back. The only trouble is that when some of my friends see me, one of my good friends, in fact, said that when she sees me now, she says that I look like the bad guy in a World War II movie. We're friends like that, right? But anyway, I'm wearing my cowboy hat today because, you know, since I think I'm in Doug Malfa territory, right? I decided that, you know, I better look the part. Actually, you know, I knew Doug back down in Sacramento when he was a state senator, and I love Western outfits too, as you can tell, right? And so I used to say that, you know, Doug and I were like Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger, twins, you know, separated at birth.
That's great.
Yeah, but anyway, I say, I mean, if you think that seeing a Japanese guy in a cowboy outfit is one thing, you ought to see me in my kilt. Yeah, actually, my wife and I got married in Scotland, and so I got married in a full kilt and regalia, and we got married in an 18th century Scottish castle. It's funny, my wife is Scotch-Irish, but I was the one who was big on Scottish things. In fact, she was big on Japanese things. And so, you know, only in America, right? So, anyway, and in fact, I collected all this Scottish tartan, but even before we got married, and it was all in her family tartan by chance, so it was meant to be, you know? So, anyway, thanks again for everybody for coming out here. I appreciate it. I'm here to talk to you about Common Core, and I'm sure that you know, some of you know quite a bit about Common Core. Some of you, you know, maybe have heard about it, are kind of new to the subject. And so, what I want to do today is give you a bit of background on Common Core. I've written a book on Common Core called Obama's Education Takeover, which came out a couple years ago. And, you know, it's funny, when I wrote this book and it came out in 2012, nobody knew what Common Core was, right? If you think about it, I'm sure all of you, I mean, when was the first time you heard about Common Core? I'm sure that a lot of you heard about it only this year or maybe at the earliest last year, you know, but it's a pretty good welcome. Anyway, it's a new issue for a lot of you, and even though Common Core was adopted in most states way back in the summer of 2010. So how is it that all of you right now are just hearing about it? Well, I'm going to tell you about why that is. But this book, I got a whole bunch over there, and they're available for purchase, and you know, they're just $5. So good round figure. Anyway, so how did Common Core get started? You know, if you listen to the proponents, the supporters of Common Core, they'll always lead with the fact that Common Core was a state-led, voluntary project, right? And so, well, nothing could be further from the truth. It wasn't state-led. What it was insider-led. And so, if you go back and look at the chronology of how Common Core came into existence, you find that it had its origin in the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Now, the Council is the Association of State Superintendents of Public Instruction, kind of all the Tom Torriksons of this world. And then also this insider education group called Achieve Incorporated. So the three of those organizations got together to put together Common Core. And so in 2008, the NGA, National Governors Association, and the Council of Chief State School Officers, and Achieve released a report calling for national standards. And they called for a strong state and federal partnership. The following year, okay, in June of 2009, the Governors Association and the Council announced their decision to develop common national education standards as a consequence of the report the previous year. And then, the following month, in July of 2009, the Governors Association and the Council, they formed several committees, all right? And the first committee consisted of about a dozen members who wrote the Common Core curriculums, Common Core standards. And now, just so that all of you know, this committee was not populated by Arnold Schwarzenegger and Andrew Cuomo and, you know, other governors in the states. No, it was populated by insiders, most of them who were from testing companies, who were doing all of this behind closed doors. These were mostly drawn from insider groups, people that none of us had ever heard of nor ever voted for before. Now the second committee consisted of 2 feedback groups. And these feedback groups had, as their members, were there to provide research and advice to the first group, the standard writers, okay? Now there was a third committee, which was called the Validation Committee, which was formed in September of 2009. And this committee was there to ensure that the standards were actually research and evidence-based, right? Now, if you have heard the proponents of Common Core, they will argue not only is it state-led and voluntary, they'll say that it's research-based, it's got all this evidence to back it up, right? Well, they put together this validation committee to supposedly ensure that that was going to be the case. However, if you look at all the members of these 3 committees, actually 4 committees, what you find is that only one of the 60 members of all these committees was actually a teacher. All of the standards, writing, and discussion was sealed by confidentiality agreements and held in private. There was no public input, which is unsurprising given the fact that all of you are now just learning about it, right? Now, parents who early on did learn about what was going on and who tried to have input were shut out because of the fact that the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Delegate Association, their meetings were closed to the public. So they could not have any input, even if they knew about it to begin with, which was a very small group of people. But even the people who were on these committees were often in the dark about what was going on in this whole process. So Mark Bauerlein, who is a professor at Emory University, which is a good university in Atlanta, Georgia, and he was a member of the feedback committee. Now remember, the feedback committee was supposed to provide research advice to the standard writers, okay? So Professor Bauerlein said, quote, "I have no idea how much influence committee members had on the final product. Some of the things I advised made their way into the standards, some of them didn't. I'm not sure why or how." And then we have James Milgram, who is a really respected, one of the most respected mathematics professors in the country from Stanford University. And in fact, he was one of the architects of California's very rigorous previous state academic content standards, the standards that Common Core replaced here in California, right? He was one of the architects. He said that, and he sat on the validation committee, which again was supposed to determine whether the Common Core was research and evidence-based. He said the facilitators for his validation committee meetings were virtually impossible to deal with. The facilitators were emphatically trying to not let us act according to our charter, but simply sign or not sign a final approval letter when the charter said we had final say over the quality of the final Common Core and could revise or rewrite it if we deemed it necessary. So Professor Milgram has testified in various state legislatures around the country that the Common Core standards are not internationally competitive and do not prepare students for selective universities. He refused to sign off on the final Common Core set of standards. In fact, according to Professor Milgram, by the 5th grade, Common Core math is 1 year behind our top international competitor nations, and by the 7th grade, Common Core is 2 years behind. So when you hear, for example, Common Core supporters say that Common Core is internationally benchmarked, which is a buzzword that they use, is that it's comparable to international standards and some of the best standards around the world, that's not true. Professor Milgram says that they're several years behind. And again, that's not by the 12th grade, that's by the 7th grade. So, but that's not all. He himself, Professor Milgram, refused to sign off on the Common Core because of these huge glaring deficiencies. And yet, when the Common Core Committee released this letter from his validation committee, they did not list the fact that there were several members who refused to sign off and did not publish their dissent. So you have the idea that it was a unanimous agreement amongst this validation committee that yes, this Common Core set of national standards were actually research and evidence-based when people like Professor Milberg, one of the top mathematics experts in the country, said that they weren't. And so again, this is how it was sold to state legislatures and state boards of education across the country when it was being rolled out and hurriedly adopted in that summer of 2010. Well, how did the Obama administration get involved in all of this? As you see in my book, the title of it is called Obama's Education Takeover. Now, all this time I've been talking about the closed-door, ultra-secret proceedings by the Council of Chief State School Officers, the CHIEF, and the National Governors Association. Where does President Obama come in? Well, he comes in through a couple of things. What they wanted to do is basically use the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers as basically stalking horses for their centralization agenda. So they themselves knew that the U.S. Department of Education could not come out and propose this thing because, it would just create a furor because it would be obvious that it was going to be a top-down type of situation from Washington. So what they did was they decided to use a side door to achieve the same thing. So what they did was they they created, remember the stimulus program? The billions, the hundreds of billions of dollars that were allocated to, supposedly improve the economy, most of which ended up, going to simply preserve the status quo government jobs of many state workers around the country. In the stimulus program, there was $100 billion that was allocated for education. And within that $100 billion, there was a pot of $4 to $5 billion called the Race to the Top Fund. And Race to the Top was a competitive grant program. So states had to apply to this program to get money, and they had to promise they were going to enact various types of reform to improve student achievement, all of which sounded pretty good, right? But in order to win a grant, one of the conditions in order to get the necessary points to basically make it up to consideration level was the fact that you had to agree to adopt Common Core. So that's why, even though you hear the proponents of Common Core saying that this was a voluntary program led by the states, it was actually a top-down arm twister led by the Obama administration using federal dollars as a carrot in order to get the states to adopt Common Core. And they had a stick. So they used the carrot of federal dollars, but there was also a stick involved. You've all heard of the No Child Left Behind Act, right? Well, under No Child Left Behind, by the year 2014, surprise, this year, all states have to have 100% of their students proficient in the basic subjects of English and mathematics, right? Well, given the state of our public schools, that was not a realistic goal to begin with, but most states were very far from meeting that goal. So in order to get a waiver from the requirements of No Child Left Behind, the Secretary of Education said that you had to adopt Common Core. So you had the carrot of federal funding and the stick of the federal waiver from federal law. Now, when looking at this scenario, state legislators, were very candid about what was going on. I quote one of those legislators, I think he's either from Wyoming or Wisconsin, one of the W states. And he said that this is, referring to race to the top. He said, it's not a race to the top, it's a race for the money. That's what all the states were doing, because if you remember back in 2010, all the states were broke. And so even a few $100 million is going to mean a lot to states. And so therefore they were willing to adopt the Common Core basically sight unseen. In fact, several states, like Kentucky for example, just actually approved the adoption of Common Core before Common Core was even released. And so you can't have public input on something where there's no final product. So what has been the observations of some schools? Well, one of the people in Washington who's been keeping an eye on Common Core, thankfully, has been Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. Republican senator there, and he said that in order to get Common Core adopted quickly in the 50 states, it was tied to race to the top money. A lot of the states thought they would get a lot of money, and not more than a dozen states actually did. In fact, California, which dropped its rigorous state standards in favor of the weaker Common Core standards, didn't get any race to the top money. So we intentionally dumbed ourselves down with no payoff. So Grassley says that, he says that a lot of states thought they would get a lot of money, not more than a dozen actually did, but they accepted the principle of Common Core. Also, if the state wanted waivers from No Child Left Behind, it also involved Common Core. From that standpoint, it's the pressure of Washington to bring Common Core as a national approach. And the Common Core shouldn't be crammed down the people's throats by the Secretary of Education in Washington, D.C. using federal money. And he's absolutely right. That doesn't stop the involvement of the federal government. It's not just that carrot and stick. There's ongoing involvement by the federal government in the creation and development of federal-supported testing aligned with Common Core. Because, okay, Common Core is our national standards, right? Basically, they tell you that, in the 5th grade, Johnny or Janie are going to have to know X, Y, and Z, right? I'll go into that in more detail. But that's not the end of it. There's a whole regime that's associated with Common Core. So you have the standards, then you have the testing that's aligned with those standards, and then you have the curriculum that's aligned with the testing and the standards. So when you hear people say that, well, they're only standards, they're not. It's the whole ball of wax. You adopt one, you adopt all three. And so the federal government is hugely involved in the other two. So they have spent several $100 million supporting the consortia, the groups who are putting together the testing system that is aligned with Common Core. In fact, you may have heard that several states have actually dropped out of that testing consortium. And that's because they're getting heat from all people like you who are now starting to hear about Common Core and begin to become extremely worried about what it entails for your children and the future of this country. The trouble with a lot of this stuff, as you can imagine by now, is the fact that the fix is in, right? Who knows about this so far? It's a small group of insiders, people, not our elected governors, not really our state superintendents of public instruction. We're talking about a small group of people who are from organizations, companies that none of us have ever heard of before, and none of us know, and none of us can have any impact upon. And so the American Institutes of Research, which is a big think tank based back in the Washington, D.C. area, and I've worked with them before, they smell this rat. And they, with regard to this testing contract that was given out basically to a single company, to the Pearson Publishing Company, the American Institutes for Research charged that the contract process to administer and score the Common Core test for states within one of the testing consortia, there are two testing consortia in the country, but one of them, which a lot of states belong to, now that just the contract for that group was worth several billions of dollars, all right? The contract requests bundled development and delivery of first-year testing, and the Pearson Publishing Company, which is, for those of you who are involved in education, know Pearson, I'm sure. It's a huge, massive publishing company. They dominate the field in many ways. And so they were already working on a lot of this testing. So the American Institutes of Research says that Pearson got an automatic and insurmountable advantage because of the way the bid was set up for this contract for the testing. And so even though the American Institutes for Research wanted to bid on the contract, they couldn't. Why? It's not just because the fix was in, the big fix was in. All right? They launched a protest saying the bidding process was unfair and unlawfully restricted competition. How was this true? Well, AIR, American Institutes of Research, sent a complaint about the process to the individual who was identified as the only person that potential bidders could contact about the process. But sometime later, now after the deadline for filing a complaint had elapsed, AIR was told that the protest was sent to the wrong person. And that it had missed the deadline, and therefore its claim of illegal bid process was not going to be heard. Well, AIR is now suing, and let's hope that there's some justice done, or at least some light shed on why this all took place. I mean, AIR is one of the most respected research organizations in the country, and for them to make this accusation that the bidding process was rigged for a single company to win, and that the complaint process was also basically rigged in order to ensure failure by anyone who did complain, shows you, the type of ramrod that Common Core has become. I mentioned about the lack of quality of Common Core vis-a-vis international standards. Even now, for those of us in California, let's put it this way. Every state in this country, under the No Child Left Behind Act, had to adopt its own set of state academic standards. So California had its own standards, Massachusetts had its own standards, etc., right? Now, there are lots of things wrong with California education, right? But one of the good things about it is that fact that the state standards that the state adopted back in the late 1990s were actually really good standards. In fact, even the pro-Common Core think tank, the Fordham Institute, which rates state standards, said that not only did California receive A plus or A grades on all of its standards, math and English, but when you compared it to the Fordham Institute's own rating of Common Core standards, California's were better than the Common Core, even on the Fordham Institute's own rating system. So why would we want to trade in our own former rigorous state standards with something that was demonstrably inferior, even according to supporters of Common Core? That's the question I asked, way back in the old book. How are the standards under Common Core inferior to California? Well, I'll give you several examples. But in 2010, right, when California adopted Common Core, remember, all the states in the summer of 2010 were rushing to adopt Common Core for a race to the top money. So when the State Board of Education voted for Common Core, they knew, however, that one of the big problem areas for California was going to be when to do algebra. Because in California, under our former state standards, algebra was required for most students in the 8th grade. Now, in Common Core, however, formal algebra is not required until the 9th grade, right? And so, that's a problem, all right? And I'll tell you why in just a second. But the State Board of Education at the time said that they tried to have it both ways. So they decided, okay, we're going to keep both the 8th grade state standards, and we're going to also keep the 9th grade Common Core standards. And they tried to have a parallel track standards for algebra. You could choose one or the other, right? Have their cake and eat it too. Well, it turns out a few years later, when the composition of the Board of Education changed, that the State Board reversed itself and said that because of requirements of No Child Left Behind or federal law, saying that you can really only have one set of standards, they had to choose Common Core. So away went California's former 8th grade algebra standards, and in came Common Core 9th grade algebra standards. Now what's the problem with that, right? If you think about it, if you want to take calculus by the 12th grade, how do you take that? think about the progression of math courses you need to take in order to get to calculus by the 12th grade. They can't do it, right? At least under the system that we're all familiar with, right? You know, algebra, geometry, algebra 2, trigonometry, you know, calculus. And so, but if you start